Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to see your names again and some of your faces. I'm Leslie Bartlett. I'm the Faculty Director for the Institute of Regional and International Studies here at UW-Madison. And IRIS, as we call it, is a consortium of 9 area studies institutes that look at issues all around the world. And we're really delighted to have you and have our speakers here with us today. I want to thank our co-sponsors and co-hosts, which include the Center for East Asian Studies at UW-Madison, the Midwest Institute for International and Intercultural Education, Gutman Community College, and the Borough of Manhattan Community College. So thanks to all of those institutions. I want to give a special thanks to Essie Lenchner and Carmen Pitts, who are our tech gurus, and they're available if you have any tech issues during tonight's talk. I want to also let you know that the event is being recorded. No participant shows up on the screen. It's the speaker who shows up, but wanted to let you know that. So I'm going to take just a few minutes to introduce to you our 2 moderators for this afternoon's events. Dr. Jennifer Delfino is Assistant Professor of Academic Literacy and Linguistics at the Borough of Manhattan Community College at the City University of New York. She's a linguistic anthropologist whose research focuses on language and racialization. Dr. Delfino's current research examines how African-American students use language to navigate and transform oppressive racio-linguistic ideologies. And her forthcoming projects explore whites' discursive appropriation of wokeness on social media and language and identity among Filipino-American college students in the New York area. Our second moderator for tonight is Dr. Rochelle Peck. Dr. Peck is an assistant professor at the Center for Ethnic Studies at the Borough of Manhattan Community College. Her current book project, called Nairobi Hip Hop Flow, is an interdisciplinary study that combines ethnography, archival research, political history, and music and performance analysis to account for the emergence and innovations of Nairobi's rap culture. Her research interests include Kenyan and US popular culture, Black performance theory, music studies, Afrofuturism, and gender and sexuality studies. We're delighted that they could be here with us this evening to moderate the conversation. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Peck, who will introduce our speaker for the afternoon.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening. I'm so excited to be here and thank you all for being here today. I'm introducing today's speaker. Stephen Ridley is a professor of modern Japanese studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research interests include 1960s counterculture, Expo 70, Japanese Kish, and the topological imaginary in 20th century Japan. He has written on the literary uses of cinema and has taught courses on anime and Japanese cinema. And I will turn it over to Dr. Ridley. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rochelle, and thank you, Leslie. Thanks for everyone who put together this event and everyone who's taken time to join us today. Can you hear me okay? Rochelle, you can hear me? All right, great.
Yes.
So I'm going to jump right in. I've chosen Tampopo as a great film to teach in connection to Japanese culture, because I think one of the great challenges of trying to teach Japan is that we tend to think that we either know nothing about Japan, that it's far more mysterious than almost any other culture, or that we know too much about Japan, that we've sort of got it figured out. It's either everything is topsy-turvy, so everything is sort of opposite to how things work in the West, or it follows these basic principles of group orientation, or some kind of shame culture, something like that. And I think what's important when teaching Japanese culture is to remember that this is a huge country. It's very diverse. People live in different ways. There are class tensions in Japan, despite a lot of commentary about a uniform middle class culture. and this film does a really wonderful job, I think, of exploring some of the culinary diversity within Japan, the way that food from all around the world is imported, and maybe there's a little bit of a spin put on it. But then it is consumed in a variety of different ways, and it means radically different things to different people, even if there is some kind of consensus around, what makes good quality food in certain categories. So I really love what Tampopo does as a kind of exploration of Japanese food culture and ways in which we can think about it. Of course, it's a comedy, and I think it's been appreciated as a comedy internationally. It's in the Criterion collection, which I think is somewhat rare for a comedy. Itami, the director, comes from a filmmaking family. His father was also a filmmaker, Itami Mansaku. And so he runs in those kinds of circles, and I think you can see in the film that he's playing around quite a bit with genre, and so as a sort of genre picture, it makes a lot of sense. But I think it is quite interesting to have a film about obsession with ramen to make it in with the art film circuit. So let me walk through where this film fits in my syllabus. And then I'll give you a little sample of how I might teach ramen and teach Tampopo. And then we can kind of close with some thoughts about the film and some resources that might be useful to you if you're thinking about integrating Japanese cinema into either a cinema class or into some kind of introduction to world culture, Japanese culture, East Asian culture. Okay, so let's see here. I am unable to move my slide. Oh, here we go. Okay, so my plan for today, I want to talk about where this fits in a large lecture introduction on East Asian civilization. This is a food unit in a class that has these three clusters. So we talk about music and food, and then we talk about futurism and nostalgia in East Asia. And then I've got these units on play and fear. And I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. Then I want to talk a little bit about noodles in Japan and ramen types, and then Tampopo as a film itself. And I think an interesting comparison is sushi, especially global sushi. So now that ramen has become yet another export of Japan, both, we had the instant version growing up, the cheap $1, even 25-cent version. Now there's the high-end version that seems to be available in most cities. And it's joining sushi as these sort of emblematic forms of Japanese cuisine. So I want to talk about that in comparative context. So where does this fit in the syllabus? So I teach a big intro survey. It's a large lecture class on the introduction, called the Introduction to East Asian Civilizations, cross-listed in multiple departments. And I was trying to figure out a way to do this that didn't just try to march everybody through 5,000 years of history, which seems like it would be shallow at best. So working together with a graduate student, we came up with this thematic approach, looking at music, food, et cetera, as I mentioned. And what we tried to do is set a theme for each day that would be interesting. So hip hop, karaoke, rock and roll, punk and noise for music. And then to highlight one of the three major East Asian cultures, China, Japan, or Korea, in three of those units, and then to have one day that really tried to look across those divides as much as possible. So sort of Trans-Asian day. So we did a music unit, and then we did a food unit, and it opens with Tampopo as a film shown in class. And then I would lecture after we watched the film on ramen versus sushi. There's a great book called Slurp, all about the culture of ramen in Japan by Brock Kushner. I think that a chapter of that will be made available to everyone who's attending, which is what I tend to pair with it. We talk about kimchi, Szechuan cuisine, meat and sort of animal protein consumption in Japan and China and Korea. a futurism unit where we look at Chinese science fiction, media art such as Namjoon Pak, and this architecture movement in Japan called metabolism that tries to create these organic buildings that can shift and change as needed. A day on the East Asian World's Fairs. I've done some research on the 1970 World's Fair in Osaka, so that's a day to talk about these international exhibitions and the way that they brand the future. And then, and I show a Korean sci-fi movie. And then we talk about nostalgia, so looking back toward childhood, in China, looking back toward the socialist period with nostalgia for the sort of costumes of the Mao era, the issue of royalty or thinking back toward the Japanese throne, the issue of unity and Taiwan's place in East Asia, etc. And then we close with play and fear. So video games, baseball, the Beijing Olympics, and then things that people are afraid of, such as environmental disaster. Under the Dome is about air quality problems in China. I do a day on the nuclear power industry and Fukushima and the meltdown. And then this question of security and the Anthropocene. So, you know, rather than thinking about war, so much thinking about climate disaster as the primary opponent around which we could all rally in solidarity. So that's how the class is set up. The study of food, I think, is particularly rich to generate student interest, and it meshes really nicely with trends in academic work. So food studies is super hot. I think everyone has seen that. It's a hot area of research. We can talk about food security. We can talk about basic human right of access to nutritious and plentiful food sufficient to sustain life. We can talk about sustainability issues, so GMOs, farmers markets, community-supported agriculture, agribusiness, etc. And then in my realm of literature and cultural studies, you can talk a lot about food and cultural identity or cultural representation. My friends in the history department laughed at me when I said I wanted to get somebody in to do a guest lecture on kimchi to talk about Korea, because it's so cliched. But once my colleague actually looked into it, he discovered that the history of kimchi is quite fascinating, that there is pickled food all across East Asia, and it was always denigrated by Western visitors who said it was completely unpalatable. And then it kind of dies out in a lot of other places and becomes this kind of reversed point of pride in the Korean Peninsula, and maintains its tradition and becomes more and more meaningful over time as people try to hand down their special family recipes through their families. And it always reminds everyone of mother. So you can look at these film clips where, you know, the taste of the kimchi reminds both siblings of their mother, and they both end up crying and hugging, et cetera, et cetera. So it's quite rich. Noodles in Japan is an interesting topic, and I end up just sort of giving some basic cultural information about how this operates in my own experience of living in Japan for 7 or 8 years, observing how people eat these different noodles in different contexts, and they seem to mean different things. And so there's a thick white wheat flour noodle you might be familiar with called udon, that is often paired with soba, this light buckwheat noodle. It's light brown in color. And so a lot of restaurants that specialize in noodles will have both udon and soba on the menu, and people tend to have a strong preference for one or the other. Some of this is regional. And some places will have both, will specialize only in one. So a cheap cafeteria style noodle shop will offer varieties with either noodle. So you could get the same toppings either on udon or soba, and you would make your preference. you would make your selection based on preference. These are also typically sold either hot or cold. So in the height of summertime, you would probably order it cold, zaru style. But if you're in the winter trying to warm up, you might order it hot. And then there's a faction that will flip that, right? And say, you know, you really should be eating hot food in the summer because it cools you down, conversely. I don't see a lot of people eating cold noodles in the winter, however. So here's some examples. So tempura udon, so you could have the, you know, lightly battered and fried shrimp on top. And this, you know, in the same restaurant would probably be offering this on soba as well. Zaru soba is a classic in the summer where you would stir up what's in the red container to the side and make a dipping sauce, and you would dip then the cold soba noodles into it. It's a kind of classic summer dish. Somen is the real like heat of August, peak of the heat and humidity, and you can see it's being served here with ice cubes on top. So not only has it been chilled, but it's actively being chilled right before your eyes. So at a time when, you know, your appetite may be less in the middle of the summer, you only need a small light noodle. Somen kind of comes to represent that, and here's being served with a bright green momiji leaf. So this was the leaf that will turn bright red in the fall, but you can see here it's the peak of summer with the green leaves. Hiyashichuka is something I survived on for a long time as a college student in Japan, sold at all the convenience stores. So this is basically ramen sold cold with a sauce that you would put over the top of it and then mix everything together and create a kind of chilled ramen dish. So these are commonplace, available all the time, and people tend to have strong preferences between them. Ramen operates in a slightly different register, and I think it's interesting because of that. So it's not going to be available on the menu at a place that serves either udon or soba, which are often paired. So there's a separate realm for udon and soba, and ramen operates in a different kind of realm than that. It's a specialty shop food that will typically really only sell ramen. It might have a couple of side things. So you might find gyoza or pot stickers, maybe some fried rice to make a sort of set. But the ramen is gonna be sold in its own shop. And these are gonna be $7 to $10 for a bowl at a ramen shop. It's a really classic lunch, or maybe even something that you would go and get after a night of drinking. And cheaper places would typically call it chuka soba, so Chinese soba. And when that's on the sign, it signals that it's going to be a slightly more lowbrow operation, probably a one-man shop, where maybe the food is sold by a ticket machine near the door. And the entire operation is just run by one person. It could still be very delicious, but the emphasis will definitely be on keeping the cost down. Okay, so some ramen types. So some shops will specialize in one style, but a lot of others have options for the broth. And this is a topic that comes up in the movie. Some of the classic broth flavors are shio, which just means salt. So this is a light, savory broth. Miso, which is the same as miso soup. So it will be a darker broth that will look like miso soup. I'll show you some pictures. Shoyu is a flavor for ramen. So using the flavor of soy sauce. It's even saltier than shio and dark in color. And then there's a one that's somewhat special, Tonkotsu Ramen. Tonkotsu means pork bone. So it's a very thick, light colored broth that's really rich and filling. It's kind of associated with cold places like Hokkaido in the north. And again, like the difference between soba and udon, there's a general expectation that you're going to have very strong feelings about which of these you like better. So here's shio ramen, so clear broth, light and refreshing is how I would describe it. Miso is going to look like miso soup because it's got miso in it. Shoyu is going to have soy sauce in it, and tonkotsu ramen is going to be quite thick and hearty and filling. And there are some variations on this using chicken bones and things like that, but tonkotsu is the really famous pork bone broth. Okay, so in terms of the academic work on ramen, there is some, and Barak Kushner is a PhD in history who's written an entire book on ramen. It's kind of, it's a like hybrid between sort of oral history and fandom and archival research. So his book is called Slurp, A Social and Culinary History of Ramen, Japan's Favorite Noodle Soup. He's talking about the tendency to slurp the noodles. So you want, as you saw in the film, to eat this stuff when it's as hot as possible, and it tends to be served very, very hot. And so you would slurp up the noodle, catching both the broth and the noodle and some air to cool the whole thing off at the same time. And there's kind of a lot of cultural commentary about, you know, this seemingly bizarre breach of Japanese etiquette. That Japan is this extraordinarily polite culture. Everybody is very well mannered, and yet you go into these ramen shops and everybody's slurping their noodles. It seems very bizarre. And so this gets kind of pulled out, I would say, in both Japanese and in English, as this example of Japanese people not behaving very Japanese. I'd like to push back on that a little bit and just think about putting this into context of our practices when we drink hot tea or coffee. You're going to sip or slurp a hot tea or coffee as well, and it sort of is a very natural and a kind of obvious solution to the problem of drinking hot liquids. And so the film, I think, does a great job. Itami, I think, sets this up perfectly, of having this sort of lowbrow culture kind of associated with working class men around ramen. But the secret history, or the dirty little secret, is that everybody eats ramen, right? And so when you have these highbrow women trying to go to their like Miss Manners class at the fancy restaurants, the entire class is to try to unteach them how to eat noodles as you would eat ramen, and to teach them how to eat very, very politely a dainty little portion and make no noise whatsoever. But of course, in the film, very hilariously, they all look over and they see one foreigner eating his spaghetti, you know, forkful by forkful, and kind of slurping it in. And once it's been authenticated in that way, all of the polite ladies at their lesson begin to eat their spaghetti like they would ramen. So I think Itami is playing around with this concept and pushing back on some of the idea that that Japan is as universally polite as we tend to believe. Kushner's book is really interested in this phenomenon of the development of a new industry for ramen experts. There's as much interest in books about ramen as there is in ramen itself, and people will become these self-proclaimed experts and you know eat at a different ramen shop every day and report back on their 1,000 different ramen shop experiences. There are ramen museums now, ramen stadiums. Ramen fandom has become a subculture itself, and there's some very large companies like Namco getting involved in this industry now. So the sort of ramen obsession has become an industry unto itself. A bit more on Kushner. He's interested in looking at ramen culture in terms of this platform food. So it's similar to sandwich in the sense that there's a basic format that is expected to be followed. But then the way that people consume ramen is to almost always put a little bit of their own spin on it. So you can see, especially at the ramen shop in the film that's right next to the train station, so you get this flood of people coming in all at once. What is dazzling to Tampopo and Goro there, and that they're trying to learn from, is the way that this ramen chef is able to take all of those orders seemingly simultaneously, one after another, and each one has a little tweak on the menu. So somebody's going to want a little bit more bamboo shoots. Somebody's going to want their noodles a little bit harder, a little bit softer. Somebody's going to want an extra piece of pork. Everybody's putting their own spin on it, and so the idea is that you have this base structure, this platform, and then you put a little bit of a personalization on the dish to make it your own. And I think the assumption is that people would make that precise order every single time. So they, over time, would have refined their taste until they get down to exactly what they want, and then that's what they would order every time. So you would add more or less of a little of something. The noodles might be harder or softer than normal, and you could put in some extra. So a little bit extra, maybe 1.5 times as much noodles, or you might add an egg, or you might or add corn or butter, etc. So what becomes interesting, I think, in this film is the way that it talks through food obsessions and self-consciousness about that kind of obsession. That this is about celebrating a love of food and creating a sense of ownership over these kinds of food obsessions. What I'd like to do is, I think Tampopo is responsible for creating a sort of subgenre of comedy in Japan that is about Japanese food and Japanese customs, and is sort of instructive, like, this is the way you're supposed to do it, here's the proper way. And it's self-conscious in the sense that it's recognizing the hyper precision with which people often do consume things in Japan. But it's also at the same time poking fun at the way that Japan seems wildly mysterious and different, and that everything seems to need some kind of cultural explainer before people are comfortable moving around in Japanese spaces. So let me show you two examples of this. The first one is about sushi. Let's see if we can get this going.
寿司。日本の代表的スナック。それが寿司です。この寿司を食べるショップが寿司屋です。日本人のほとんどがこの店を毎日利用しています。これが寿司屋の入り口です。こののれんという短いカーテンをくぐるには、左から3つ目の切り込みの右側、斜め48度に 3.2 インチ上がった部分に手の甲を当て、めくります。入店が閉店予想時刻の30分前を超えた場合、まだやってる？まだやってる？まだやってる？まだやってる？を忘れずに言います。さあ、いよいよ入店です。2人なんだけど、これは人数を表します。同様に3名の場合は3人なんだけど、4名の場合は4人なんだけど、と言います。ただし、1人の場合は目で若干の申し訳なさを表すのがポイントです。寿司屋に来たらカウンター席を利用するのが醍醐味です。しかし、気軽に座るわけにはいきません。礼儀作法を重んじる日本では必ず、先に来ている隣の客に、ここ、よろしいですか？を言います。これは空席を確認する言葉です。店員にではなく、客に声をかけるのが日本人の義理と人情スタイルなのです。逆に、ここよろしいですかを言われてそこが空席だった場合、快く、どうぞ、と言いましょう。ここまでをきちんとこなして、初めてカウンター席に座ることができるのです。いよいよ注文です。寿司屋にはウェイターやウェイトレスはいません。ではどうするのか。客は欲しいメニューをマスターに直接オーダーします。 主なメニューはどの寿司屋でも同じです。代表的なメニューに大トロ、中トロ、トロがあります。これはマグロの質を表します。大トロは最高級、油分を多く含み大変美味とされています。シャリと呼ばれる米も最高級ブランドのコシヒカリを使用しています。一方、トロは低所得者向けのジャンクフードです。魚はリサイクル品を使用。米は使わず、麦やパスタを刻んだフェイクの米を使用してあります。ビール。ビールは人気のドリンクメニューです。栓は抜いてもらえますが、注ぐのはセルフサービスです。2人以上の場合、互いに注ぎ合うのが日本でのマナーです。ビジネス関係の場合は、目下の人が目上の人に先に注ぐのが大切な決まりです。まあまあまあまあ、これは注ぐときに必ず言わなければならない言葉です。同様に注がれるときは、おっとっとっとを言います。まあまあまあまあ、おっとっとっと。まあまあまあまあ、おっとっとっと。まあまあまあまあ、おっとっとっと。
So this last part is funny because it's true that you will hear mama mama otototo, and people joke about it constantly in these kind of business situations. The video goes on. I think it's about 7 or 8 minutes, and it's clever because it's this mix of accurate depictions of the minutia of sushi eating together with completely ridiculous absurdities thrown in, like that you should eat the salt that's been placed outside of the sushi shop upon leaving as a purification ritual or something like that. Here's another one about soy sauce that was circulating online.
大豆の星からやってきた正義の使者だキッコーマン醤油をたちまちかけたなら食べ物食うとうまくなる外食なんてぶっ飛ばせ必殺技だキッコーパンチ目玉焼きには醤油だろ Show me 醤油キッコーマンキッコーマン Show me 醤油キッコーマン大豆の星からやってき
Okay, I think you get the point. So setting up, soy sauce to battle against other forms of sauce, and the Kiko man is going to come out on top. Okay, some analytical problems here. Krishner suggests that the ramen boom that he's identifying in Japan from the 1980s to present, and let's remember Tampopo was 1985, is about nostalgia for the 1950s, a time when America was cool. It was particularly cool in Japan. Youth culture was coming over, etc. And I think that leaves us to ponder why it is that the 1980s would see this kind of nostalgia for the 1950s. 1950s in Japan is, it's just 5 years after the war. So it was a rebuilding period. There wasn't a lot of wealth. There was a lot of scrappiness, little three-wheeled trucks, people living in tiny spaces, trying to get back on their feet. And it will build into the 1960s when Japan successfully goes through an income doubling project of trying to expand the Japanese economy enough that everyone's salary will double by the end of the decade, which they achieved. And so what you find in the 70s and 80s is looking back, as the economy is booming again in the 80s, is looking back at a time when life was perhaps a little bit simpler, there was more scrappiness. People were struggling. This kind of bootstrap mentality, and that is only going to get stronger in the 90s and after 2000, when the economy gets really stagnant. The bubble of the 80s bursts, and people are constantly looking to see if they can recreate some of the boom times of the 50s and 60s. And so there's quite a bit of nostalgia that emerges, I would say, in the 1990s and into the 2000s to look back at the boom era of the 50s and 60s. What I think is interesting here is that Kushner is finding ramen itself and an interest in ramen to maybe be the front end of that nostalgia. And so Tampopo might be properly understood as kind of early for valuing lowbrow food from a previous era. That is a broader tendency that we'll see emerging more in the 90s and beyond. Let's see. I think one of the things I do with my class is to think about cheap comfort food that matters a lot to us. And everybody has this stuff in Wisconsin. The classic local thing is Friday night fish fry, which is available in every single tavern in the state, and people get really obsessed with it. There are big websites, rating the fish fry at any, all the bars and range, and it has a lot of similarities to ramen. So there are all these rules, right? It has to be served on a paper plate. There has to be a piece of rye bread. All the food on your plate is the same color. It's all this kind of yellow brown. And then all of the attention is placed on how fresh the fish is. It needs to be coming straight out of the fryer. And all of the sort of connoisseurship is about the breading. So people will debate endlessly about, which restaurant or bar has the best breading on the fish. And so you see the same kind of dynamics playing out as you do with this cheap and dirty food of ramen in Japan. And this has worked very well in class to get people to talk about it, what kind of comfort food they look forward to or that they turn to when they're nostalgic about home, for example. What I think the film is doing that's particularly interesting politically is valorizing connoisseurship of a lowbrow kind of food precisely in the middle of the bubble economy. So these were boom years, especially in Tokyo, but around Japan. And when you saw rapidly expanding inequality, the real estate prices were jumping tremendously. This is the time, when Japanese businesses were buying up properties internationally in Hawaii and New York. There was a bunch of backlash to this, Japan bashing and punitive tariffs on luxury Japanese cars, etc. So in the midst of all of that kind of red hot business culture, Itami is going to turn his attention toward food that's far more associated with the working classes, with everyday life, with regular people, and trying to, I think, show that you can be just as obsessive with something like ramen as you could with high-end cuisine at a Michelin-starred restaurant, right? So he's doing something somewhat interesting with culture and food and class. I think, particularly when we think about this film embedded in the cultural moment of 1985. Okay, Tampopo. So a few more thoughts. One of the ways I think to get into this film is to start thinking about it as more than a film just about ramen. There's a lot of different kinds of food that are depicted in the film, and each of them is meaningful. So the spaghetti in the Western restaurant is quite meaningful. The helper guy who's in the back room with all the high-end executives who all order exactly the same food. They have no creativity, they have no knowledge. And their helper who's carrying their briefcases is the one who actually understands cuisine and down to the Paris restaurant that the chef trained at, et cetera. So it's a spoof of maybe the inverse relationship between knowledge or wisdom and class as it applies to food culture. The scam artist, there's all these weird vignettes, right? And obviously they all have to do with food. But I think we can look at them systematically in the sense that each one tends to feature a different kind of cuisine. So the professor who is having this like very grand feast at a Chinese restaurant, he's eating Peking duck. The other guy at the table is trying to scam him out of his savings, but what that guy doesn't realize is that the person he's trying to scam is a professional con artist. And there's a joke about him being a sitting duck in this Peking duck restaurant that doesn't get translated in the subtitles. But it's there, and it's part of the onslaught of puns and situational comedy that Itami is taking us on. The other thing I thought was significant is when Tampopo and Goro go out on their date, they're at a Korean barbecue restaurant, so eating meat that they're grilling at their table. And so I think the idea here that we've got, this woman, a single mother, trying to put together her restaurant to make ends meet and raise her son, is cooking this imported Chinese noodle. She's going around on these spy missions, trying to glean ideas and steal ideas and learn as much as she can about it. So we have a very Japanese formation of a Chinese noodle that is being set up in distinction from the way that spaghetti is being consumed at this high-end Western restaurant. And then you get this Peking duck, you get Korean barbecue. The range of cuisine in the Japanese scene is on display, right? We're kind of getting this smorgasbord when the film is looked at as a whole. Okay, so versus sushi, and then I'll finish up. I think the sushi explosion internationally gives us an interesting comparison to ramen. And ramen sort of, I think, followed the same networks as it moved into cities around the world. The most basic thing we can say about sushi is that it's just wildly overpriced, right? Restaurants will flip their format. This happens in Madison regularly, from Chinese food to Japanese food, mainly to make more money on sushi, right? Supermarkets are getting in on the game now. They're making enough money on this to hire a specialized staff member to sit there and roll sushi all day. So it's a value-added product. It's very good for business. What's fascinating about it, and what Ted Bester has written about, an anthropologist from Harvard, who Kushner references in his chapter that will be circulated, is that the globalization of the tuna industry and the globalization of sushi has set things up so that all tuna caught anywhere in the world gets sent to Tokyo. So there's one fish market in Tokyo, in the Tokyo Bay, called Tsukiji, where the prices you can get for bluefin tuna are so much higher than they are anywhere else in the world, that this crazy stuff happens, such as a bluefin tuna caught off the coast of Maine that's going to end up being sold as sushi in New York City is first going to get flown to Tokyo, so flash frozen on the boat, sent to Tokyo for pricing and evaluation. And then it'll be shipped back once it's sort of certified as sushi and graded to New York to be sold in a sushi restaurant where it's been authenticated as Japanese, right? So this market is creating very strange kind of patterns of movement that I guess reflect global demand, but also create a very different kind of thing than a local lowbrow ramen experience, right? Here's just a quick scene of the early morning. You have to get there at about 4 a.m. to see the tuna market at Tsukiji. But this is where bluefin tuna from all over the world will be graded and sold. at auction, and then they would be chopped up by the various shops that operate inside this market. Okay, to wrap up, I'll just make a couple of recommendations. If you're looking for places to find something to read about Japanese film that you might be interested in integrating into a class, there's obviously a ton of stuff on Japanese cinema, but some of the more accessible things are things like Keiko McDonald's, reading a Japanese film. This is broken up into 16 different chapters. Each one is about a specific film, including another Itami Juzo film. And it's very balanced between film studies oriented analysis and cultural criticism. So kind of making sure we don't miss the point because of something to do with Japanese culture. It's readable and teachable. I think undergraduates could handle it no problem. One of the problems with Japanese cinema studies is that a lot of the stuff written about it in English is really oriented toward a graduate student audience. And so it is somewhat difficult to find good stuff for undergrads. And if people are interested in folding in anime to classes, which I also recommend, there's a similar book, Interpreting Anime by Christopher Bolton, who teaches at Williams, called Interpreting Anime. And again, each chapter is about a specific film that you could show. And then there was a 10-year run of a journal coming out of University of Minnesota called Macadamia, that's about anime and manga. And the point here was to try to find a little crossover between the fans of anime and academic work on it. So the whole thing it's got this feel of merging those two realms, the academic crowd and the fans. When I've struggled to teach anime and manga with readings that are directly about the anime and manga, and I think just it just becomes challenging because I wouldn't want the students to read an analysis of a film or an anime before they watched it, and so just getting the timing right has always been challenging. I've tended to teach things that operate a little bit better in parallel. So the Kushner piece, for example, is really kind of sociological about how ramen sort of operates in Japan. And then it lines up nicely with Tampopo as a film that we could then analyze in class and in essays, either as a visual object or as something that has something to say about culture. That's most of what I had, and I'll stop here. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I look forward to questions.
Okay, thank you, Steve, for that wonderful talk. It's so fascinating to learn about the historical and class implications of food culture in Japan. I personally really enjoyed and appreciated your talk. I'd like to open the floor up to questions from the audience. I do have a couple here that I would be happy to put out to you, Steve, when you're ready, and I can continue to take questions as you think of them. We have one here from Kathy Kappa that I also I found very interesting. Kathy says, wondering what the thoughts are about ramen now in parts of Japan class-wise. My 13-year-old son and I often eat the cheap packaged stuff for breakfast because it's warm and tasty and so bad for us. But he's been making more quote unquote refined ramen dishes, as he says from his Japanese soul food cookbook. So interesting that food is a class marker.
Yeah, this is great. I think the thing I'll say about the class marker and then the sort of high-end ramen versus low-end ramen, so instant stuff versus something that you would get in a shop, is that the stuff that you're finding available in the U.S. is maps pretty nicely onto Japan, as I understand it. So Sapporo Ichiban ramen, for example, that I've eaten, all the way through college, obviously, and is available in stores all across Japan, and people will eat it. The cup noodle is available, and people certainly still eat it. and then I think what is interesting about the ramen shops is that by and large, the owners of the shops or the chefs in them take it fairly seriously. So, and maybe it's just based on places that I've lived in Japan, but I think the shop owners, very much like in Tampopo, really take pride in doing it right. So they'll make a very strong effort to optimize every part of the process and to make it maybe, I don't know if it's competitive with other places, but they're going to have a very specific understanding of what a perfect bowl is going to look like, and they'll try to make that every single time. And I think there's an expectation that you would appreciate it too, if that makes sense. The one thing I have not seen, which is somewhat strange because I bet it does exist, is a ridiculously high-end ramen shop, right? Like $100 bowls of ramen. And it's probably out there somewhere, but it is not something that I've ever encountered. The most I've ever spent in a ramen shop is about 1,200 yen, so about $12. And that's for really well-known places that people might travel a bit to go to. So it has, I think it has maintained, if not a class orientation, at least a place in the market that's within reach for most people.
Okay, thank you, Kathy, for that question, and thank you, Steve, for that very detailed answer. We have a question from Kara about how you teach the films. Do you give guidelines to students before watching? For example, I interpreted the businessman scene differently. I assumed this was a challenge to authority when they look surprised and confused by someone not making the same order.
Yeah, so I try not to coach the reading too much. I know it can be helpful to give people something, at least to give people something to look for. I feel like in this class, they already know how we've talked about music, so they know that we're going to be interested in looking at how culture is operating, how popular culture is operating in different contexts. And so I feel like the students in my class would be coming into that film screening curious about what ramen means, right? So we've already kind of established that we're looking for representation. But I tend not to give like study questions or coach it too much, in part because the fun of teaching film for me is precisely getting students, having students note things in the film that I maybe didn't focus on. So they might pick up, as you mentioned, the challenge to authority. He certainly, I don't think it's a willful rebuke to his bosses, but they are certainly, I mean, he gets kicked under the table, they all turn red, right? They're clearly upset with him. And I think the sense that you get is this, this is a meeting between two different groups, right? So they probably have three from each company, and the group that the underling is associated with is probably trying to get into a deal with the other people, so they don't want him to do anything embarrassing, but of course he can't stop himself. He's a cuisine otaku, to use a Japanese term, right? Yeah, no, but that's a great reading, I think. Thank you.
Okay, I see one more question here right now from Jesse Allen. And Jesse asks, was the gangster food erotic vignette a real scene? For some reason, I thought it was a projection of Goro.
Oh, interesting. I took it to be a real scene. but I take your point, because the whole film, and this is one of the puzzles that I haven't quite sorted out yet. You remember, well, there's a sort of, you know, the opening scene with the gangster is kind of absurd, right? He comes up and talks to the camera, and implies that there's another film happening like on the other side of the screen. So it's very meta at the beginning. You know, he's all angry about hearing people eat food at the same time that he's just had some like servants set out this gigantic feast picnic for him. So yeah, we're in the realm of magical realism at least. But I think what's also quite interesting is when Goro and Gun are first depicted, they're driving their truck through the rain, and Gun is reading to Goro, who's driving, from a book, right? And what he's reading to him from the book is a story of this ramen master who is teaching his like disciple how to properly eat ramen, right? So and then that gets represented on screen. So that I think is Goro's imagination of what that scene would look like. And so we have at least one example, and it's very early in the film, of something on screen being not real, but rather something in Goro's imagination, right? So I think it certainly sets up the possibility that other pieces of the vignettes in the film that are often all disconnected could be some kind of chain of association for things that, you know, Goro is thinking about or imagining. And so any of the ones that are not connected to the core story of Tampopo and the revitalization of her restaurant could potentially fall into that category. So I think that is a good read.
Okay, we have a question from Leslie Bartlett. Do you use any specific questions or techniques to get students prepared to analyze the film or scenes in the film? What kind of background information do you find you have to provide them so they are prepared to interpret? Would it be quite similar to what you showed us today?
Right. Thank you for that question. So I haven't taught this film in a film course, which is why I kind of opened with this quizzical comment about it being in the Criterion Collection, right? So it's been categorized outside of Japan as a film worthy of analysis. It's part of the art film tradition, perhaps. So I've only taught it in a culture class, and while we're certainly open to, you know, talking about it as a visual object and as an art object that, you know, with the decisions that are made being very conscious, I haven't taught it in a way that we go deep into the, you know, mise en scène or whatever the director is doing with the material to kind of put his own mark on it. I think one of the things that you could do if you were going to go that route, and I think the film does hold up to that. Let me give you a couple of examples. So I think one of the things you could certainly talk about is genre, right? So, you know, the film was pitched and marketed as a ramen Western. So, you know, spoofing the spaghetti Western where Clint Eastwood gets his start. So you have this sort of genre of, you know, John Wayne movies that are made in other countries, not in Hollywood. And so the idea being, you know, can you do something like that in Japan, which is why Goro needs to wear this cowboy-looking hat the whole time, even when he's in the bath, right? He takes it off to brush his hair like a Deadwood scene or something, and puts it right back on. And so you could talk about genre, but I think if you're going to talk about genre, you have to talk both about the Western and about the sort of the sports training genre of movies, right? Where somebody, you know, at the beginning is going to lose a fight or lose a contest, bad news bears, and then they're going to commit themselves to training and learn all kinds of interesting lessons from multiple different experts and build themselves up, and then have the glorious return at the end when they win the game, right? So it's following that pattern exactly, and it's very conspicuous about it, right? Goto's got the stopwatch. He's making her go out and run, timing her on how quickly she can make a bowl of ramen. And then they go and recruit, right? So they get the best noodle guy who just so happens to be the personal chef to the wealthy old man who nearly chokes on a rice cake, which is also a very kind of like a famous joke in Japan, I suppose. These are very popular around the holidays, and every year dozens of elderly people choke on mochi cakes, which get stuck in your throat really easily. And indeed, the only recommended way to solve the problem is to get the vacuum cleaner out and actually suck it out, because the Heimlich maneuver is not strong enough. So anyway, so we have the sports apprentice, we have the Western, it's comedy, so it's operating in the realm of puns and situational comedy, slapstick. It's got all the fights. So you could talk about, what is it doing with genre? Is it just eclectic? Is it really precise? And I think you could even go to the level of the camera work, in that the narrative is so disconnected. We've got all these vignettes of different people in different situations. You know, the guy who's running home to be with his wife who's dying, and the only thing he can think of to keep her alive is to ask her to make dinner, so that she'll have this sort of reason to live, to feed her family, and she makes one final dinner and then collapses, right? But that guy is sort of walking past or running past other people, and the camera has this habit of following Goto and Tampopo on their training mission, and then picking up the businessmen who are on their way to the fancy Western restaurant, and then tracking with them, right? So it'll start to pan or track and pick up another person. So I think there are filmic techniques that are worth talking about in terms of narrative continuity and development, and sort of holding together a complex set of mini narratives that are on a theme but don't really seem to interact with each other.
Okay, wonderful. I see two more questions. I'll ask the first of the two from Dr. J. I am interested in the table manners that accompany the different food shops. The table manners are such a delicate form of communication and set the appetite. I see students creating short in film classes that compare, I think shorts in film classes that compare anime food manners with American food manners. In Southeast Michigan, Friday night is Scotland soul food, McDonald's. Do you have access to comparative films?
It's a great question. Yeah, I think, I mean, maybe what the film is trying to do with manners is to talk about situational appropriateness, right? And then some of the overwrought. I mean, I think a lot of the film is a spoof of the 1%, right? And sort of aspirational nouveau riche, right? So you know, the spaghetti scene is kind of sums it up. You've got what I think are probably a bunch of upper middle class housewives who are trying to learn proper manners so that they can go on an expensive European vacation and behave appropriately in foreign countries, right? And they're being trained by someone who is speaking from authority and telling them, you know, that in foreign countries it's very rude to be noisy. But then you have this one, you know, foreign dude sitting across the restaurant who blows up that entire myth. And so I think what Itami is trying to do is to say, you know, the same kind of dynamics that we're all familiar with politeness, the association of wealth with politeness, in fact, don't hold up to scrutiny. And I think he's just trying to blow up that myth as quickly as possible, so that people don't chase that dream. And maybe it could be liberated to, invest emotionally in more accessible food, right? Instead of trying to go up the ladder. The comparative film, I don't know. Be interesting to put together a whole like film and cinema syllabus. Actually, I'm sure you could do it. But Judo Dreams of Sushi. I mean, there's plenty of Japanese food or Japanese cinema that's interested in food culture. I think where it would get really interesting is doing cross-cultural comparison, and see, not with an emphasis on both continuities and difference, right? I think if I have an axe to grind about teaching Japanese culture, it's that we focus way too much on the differences, and there's this expectation that what's significant about Japan is the ways in which it does things differently, and that's half of the story. I think the other half of the story is the continuities that Japan has with other places, and sometimes they might be coming in unexpected places. Ramen consumption might look like soul food consumption, might look like fish fry consumption in northern Wisconsin. It might, when I pitched this to my class, everybody had something from their neighborhood back home, right? That represented this. Fish and chips in a newspaper with the ink dripping down your arm is the only way to really experience it, to my friends from London, right? So I think if we get beyond like the content of the food and get to the way that it's experienced and the connections that it has and the meaning that it has for people, then you can start to see a lot of really interesting continuities across culture.
Thank you so much, Steve. May I actually interject with my own question that kind of follows from what you just said before asking the next one? I'm really curious in the affordances and limitations of a comparative perspective when you're doing cross-cultural analysis. Is there, to what degree is it kind of a hazard? I don't want to call it a hazard exactly, but that understandings of Japanese culture and what food means get folded into Eurocentric understandings of what Japan is and what it looks like, either in terms of class structure, values about food, especially when there's so much, I think, cultural exoticism that surrounds Western understandings and interests in Japan. Would you be able to say a little bit, or willing to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. I think there are actually three fallacies about Japan that make it very difficult to say anything with much assurance. I feel like the more I live in Japan, think about Japan, teach Japan, and think about talking about Japan, the less sure I am of any of the claims that I make. And so I'm open by saying that, there's this tendency either to think that we know nothing at all about Japan, everything is exotic, everything is different, or that we seem to know too much about Japan, right? That whatever we're going to encounter, there's two or three kind of truisms about what makes Japanese culture tick that will apply to each case, right? And the one that I've come across the most is this group orientation. So this circulates in like psychology circles, and this sense that everybody just wants to fit in. Nobody wants to be the nail that sticks up because you get hammered down. You hear that over and over again. And yet you go to Japan and people behave in wildly different ways. And there is no consensus. I mean, people talk about consensus all the time. And I've gone into Japanese shops. I thought it would be really interesting to get a pair of shoes made by a Japanese cobbler one time, even though they were wildly expensive. And I went in and, I told him I wear 27.5 centimeter shoe. And I'm not kidding. This guy who was probably 70 said, well, we Japanese all have the same size feet, and they're all 26.5 centimeters long. Like, you're just a centimeter too long. And I thought, this is a guy who's been making shoes for 50 years. Certainly he did not sell every single customer the same size shoes. But the myth of universality and cultural continuity, and a sort of monoculture is easily as strong in Japan as it is outside. The third that I really want to push, and this is to try to answer your question, is that it's not that Japan is inscrutable, and it's not that Japan is too scrutable. It's that Japan somehow manages to find the perfect balance between maintaining its traditions and updating everything to the most contemporary technologies, right? So it's like present and future, or present and past in perfect harmonious balance, or some kind of sample of the future, and the distant past, the samurai era, are all held perfectly together. I think that is the sort of myth right now in Japan, both inside and out. And I'm trying to figure out ways to pressure that, because culture has tensions. It has to have tensions. And to depict the culture as something that has made no compromises whatsoever and has perfectly maintained all of its traditions, and kind of encapsulated them with cutting edge technology in a way that produces no tensions whatsoever, is the fundamental myth about Japan now, that I think we always need to be critical of when we encounter it. There's just this way in which we talk about traditional Japanese something or other that just rolls off the tongue and feels completely natural. And there is no traditional Japanese Japan in 2020. It's always going to be a simulacrum of something from the past, that's in some kind of complex set of relations with other things. So that I think pressuring that kind of everything is in perfect balance narrative, I think is meaningful cultural analytical work to be done.
Thank you so much for that wonderfully detailed answer. I have another question here from the audience. Tia Van Hester asks, do you have any discussion with students about the rise of Japanese cuisine? I believe Tokyo has the most Michelin-starred restaurants per capita. And I was wondering if you are able or have discussed that contrast from ramen culture.
Yeah, I think the other thing that you could put into conversation with ramen besides sushi, I mean, sushi is kind of very everyday now, right? I mean, they've got it at like all of the supermarkets in Madison. Would be kaiseki ryori, right? So the absolute high end, every single dish is a work of art, and you could easily drop $200 or $300 on a dinner that might have 12 courses of these tiny little delicate things, and they're meant to be enjoyed as an aesthetic experience. So each one is a little miniature sculpture, and it's all completely seasonally inflected, right? So, I mean, an entry point to this might be to look at that ramen picture, the somen noodles that have a Japanese maple leaf on them. That's drawing on this kaiseki tradition where the intent is to have an experience with food that is, each one is a sculpture, each one is aesthetic, each one is delicious, but each and every dish reminds you precisely of like the 2-week period you're in the seasons, right? So You know, if you're in the second half of August, you're going to have different food than you would have in the first half of August. Or if you're moving into October, you know, and the leaves are half changed, they're going to put a half changed leaf on your plate to remind you precisely what the moment is. And all of this is going to be deeply embedded with the food. So I think you could certainly go that direction of like the blowout Michelin starred cuisine, and then talk about ways that you could bring that same kind of intensity of experience to something as simple as a hamburger or a bowl of noodles, right? I think that's where Itami wanted to take this, is that connoisseurship doesn't need to code to wealth, that you can create connoisseurs of, you know, a rice omelet, which is probably my favorite scene in the movie, right? So the one bit of trivia, so that group of beggars or homeless guys, where they recruit the sensei, like the ramen specialist who used to be an OBGYN before his wife kicked him out of the house. And they're all dirty and everything, but then they sing him a farewell song, and it's a beautiful song, right? And if you look carefully at the credits, the people that Itami recruited for that gang of homeless people is a professional choral group called the Nisho Orchestra. So it's like the best choral group in the country. You just put dirt on their faces. But anyway, you know, one of them sneaks into a restaurant and makes a beautiful French style omelet, right? I mean, it like rivals Jacques Papin's YouTube videos in its execution, but he's doing that on top of rice. And so this is like mac and cheese for Japanese kids, right? So you take old rice that you probably made the day before, you fry it up with ketchup, like it has to be regular ketchup, and then you put an omelet over the top of it, cut it, and then add more ketchup to the top of the omelet. And so this is what the kid wants to eat, and he gets like the French cuisine version of it made by a homeless chef. I mean, that kind of sums up the ethos of the film, I think, really nicely.
Thank you so much. We have about 11 minutes remaining if the audience wants to ask one or two more questions. Okay, well, Carmen has activated everyone's ability to unmute. So if you want to turn on your sound and say something on the way out, you certainly can. Steve, I'd like to thank you for a very informative and fascinating presentation. So I really appreciate being able to moderate this talk tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. I really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody for the questions. It was really fun.
Oh, we do have one more, and probably time to answer it from Jill F. As we exit, do you see a similarity between Japan and the West due to changes in technology?
Let's see. I mean, if we take your question to be one of sort of convergence, I think there is certainly, in my mind at least, there's a sort of pre-iPhone Japan and a post-iPhone Japan. I mean, my practice is I'm a book hound, and so I tend to spend a lot of time looking for books and looking for used bookstores. And the drama for years was trying to find these places, because Japanese addresses are not, there's no street names really. There are a couple street names, but basically you start with the district, and then you get a sub-district, and then you get a sub-district of that district, and then the block is numbered around the edge. So you know, you get off at the train station, you either ask a police officer or you get a very richly detailed map and kind of find some route. That changed dramatically with Google Maps on an iPhone, right? So you know, if I can walk straight to a place and get walking directions, you know, a huge part of my Japanese experience is different. And you know, they're ubiquitous in Japan as well. I don't know. Beyond that, I mean, I think maybe it will be nice to close with this. I think the big difference that I see between Japan and the United States in particular is Japan is radically international. Like Japanese people think of themselves as citizens in the world, and their interest tends to range all around the planet. They're reading books and staying up on news and watching television programs that really cover the entire international scene, and consuming media from all different countries, and yet are still perceived by the rest of the world as a very insular country that is kind of keeping to itself and doing its own Japanese thing. And I think the United States perceives itself to be this radically international place that's keeping tabs on what's going on everywhere else in the world. And to my experience, we are the most insular country I've ever been to. It's very inwardly focused, very unaware of what's going on elsewhere. And so a lot, I think, of the sort of culture shock that happens going back and forth between Japan and the US is going to Japan and realizing that I don't have anything to tell most people. They already know it. And then coming back to the US and realizing, you know, every single thing that I might say about Japan is going to be brand new to most people that I know. And so that, I think, ends up being the very strange, that's the topsy-turvy piece to me, is that Japan seems insular, but it's not. And it reveals the insularity of other places like the United States.
Thank you so much for answering that last question.
Thank you.
Carmen has some information that she's put in the chat about upcoming registration and reminders for the next event. And so Carmen, if you'd like to say anything about it, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Steve. And we'll give you all of the applause in just a moment. And we'll all just have to go to our kitchens now and figure out something to make for dinner. So the final event in our series is teaching about Africa through Timbuktu. And the information about the film is in the registration. I put the link in the chat, and that will also be in your post-event email that you should get tomorrow, along with tonight's recording and access to all of the digital materials. There are lots of great things in that folder. And then we also have an event coming up on November 30th, which is part of our human rights lecture series called Refugee Youth, Citizenship, Education, and Exclusion from Public Schooling. So we hope you can join us at that as well. And that was all of my reminders, other than you do have access to turn on your microphones if you would like to say thank you on your way out. But please join me in thanking Steve for his wonderful presentation this evening. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Great.
Thanks.
Merci. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.